Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second section in our series of events themed open source contributing beyond code. My name is Zainab Abubakar, and I'm the open source programs manager for She Code Africa and your host today. This event is organized by Women of Open Source Community Africa, WOSCA, an initiative whose goal is to drive the movement of women who are actively involved in open source within Africa. And it was initiated by two amazing communities, She Code Africa and Open Source Community Africa. Right now, I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of what open source is and the goal of this event for the benefit of those who missed this first session. So, what is open source? Open source is coined from open source software, which is a software with the license that enable users to run, distribute, study, and modify the software for any purpose. The goal of this series of events is to debunk a popular myth that open source is just for people who code. We had our first session in this series on Tuesday with Peace Ojeme, who spoke on ways designers can contribute to open source. If you missed this session, you can always watch a recap of the session on our YouTube channel at She Code Africa. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel while at it and share with your family, friends, colleagues, etc. And that brings us to the order of the day. So with us today is Edidiong Asikpo, the drip herself. So Edidiong Asikpo is a developer advocate at Hashnode. She's from Akwa Ibom, Nigeria. She's a passionate professional with multi-phase skills and experience spanning across developer advocacy, front-end development, technical writing. She's a strong advocate for sensitizing people, especially women, about the importance of a career in technology. And this passion has led her to play a major part in building communities such as Developer Circle, from Facebook, She Code Africa, Open Source Community Africa. She's an eloquent writer, speaker, and communicator with a keen interest in making open source contributions and inspiring the next generation. Sorry. And Edidiong today will be discussing with us how technical writers can contribute to open source. If you have any questions while the session is going on, drop them in the comment section and we'll attend to them after the session. With that being said, let me not waste much of our time. So I'm going to hand over to Edidiong right now so she can take over the stage. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the amazing introduction, Zainab. Can you confirm? Let me try to share my screen. Please let me know if you can see it. Guess this. I think my entire screen should be fine. So can you confirm if you can see my screen? Yeah, awesome. All right. Thank you once again for the amazing introduction, Zainab. That was really fantastic. So today, we're talking about Technical Writer's Guide to Contributing to Open Source Projects. So the documentation about an open source project serves as a platform or as a place where people learn how to contribute to that open source project or also how to use the project in general. And you would notice that even a couple of surveys have been carried out that has shown that a good documentation serves as a liveliness or like just pretty much shows that this open source organization or this open source project is actually a really good one. But even though you've seen that open source projects are like really important and it would definitely help, even though you've seen that open source documentation is really important on open source like projects, for instance, there are still tons of open source organizations that don't have a good documentation, while there are others that do not even have documentation at all, right? And then there are also literally so many technical writers as well who shy away from contributing to open source projects because they either believe that, oh, hey, maybe open source contribution is not for me, it's just for software engineers, or they don't necessarily have the skills to, or they are not aware, like they don't know how to start, like, okay, hey, I want to contribute to an open source project as a technical writer, but what do I do? Where do I start from? How do I find a project? What if this project does not have a documentation already, right? So this talk aims to give an introductory guide into how technical writers can contribute to open source projects. It will cover a brief overview of what open source is, the problem that we are facing, and how technical writers can help to solve that problem, how to actually choose an open source project and get started, and some of the benefits of contributing to open source as a technical writer. My name is Edidi Ngasipo. I work as a developer advocate at Hashnode, and I also contribute to the Video Learn open source organization as a technical writer. It's almost impossible that anybody here does not have an idea or does not know what an open source project is, but I'll just want to iterate on it one more time. So I like to see an open source project as a project whose source code and documentation is made available for use, modification, enhancement by anyone in the world. So most often you'd hear that open source projects are, okay, hey, they made the source code available, but nobody seems to put the documentation into what an open source project is. But I mean, I like to. So it's pretty much saying an open source project is not just, oh, okay, the source code is made available, but the source code and the documentation as well is made available for use, for modification, and for enhancement by anyone in the world. Another thing you notice in this particular slide is I made anyone bold, which goes further to speak that you don't have to be a software engineer to contribute to open source. You can be a technical writer, a community builder, designer, name it, any single role in tech that can be, that exists, to be honest, can also impact or like do something to help open source projects. So in 2017, GitHub carried out a survey, right, to just try to understand some of the problems that people were facing in terms of like working with open source projects or even using those open source projects. And from this survey, you'd see that, as you can see, there are like incomplete and confusing documentation, there's unresponsiveness, dismissive responses, conflicts, and the rest. But out of these people, out of 100 people who participated in this survey, 100%, so actually, it's like 5,500 people that participated in this survey, right? And out of these 5,500 people, 93% of them complained about incomplete or confusing documentation in open source projects. So let's just take a moment to think about this again. 5,500 people participated in the survey, right? And out of these 5,595 of them, I don't know if you just take a moment to think about how huge that is. 95 of them complained that this is actually wrong. This is what is making us from, this is what is stopping us from like using open source projects or even contributing to open source projects. And that goes further to say that the documentation of an open source project is arguably as important as that of the software, because hey, you can build the most amazing software in the world, right? But if I don't understand how to use that software or how to contribute to that software, then what's the essence? Like I don't really get it. So if you build something now, then you put it on your repository, and nobody knows that exists, nobody can read what the product is about to understand what that project is about, then nobody would use it, right? So that I'm just trying to explain that, hey, building open source projects are good. We have tons of open source projects, but a documentation to back up the open source project makes it so much better for like users and for contributors as well. So like I said here, it says therefore technical writers are as important as software developers in the open source ecosystem, because humans can't use or contribute to what they don't understand. If I see an amazing open source project that does not have any form of documentation or any explanation at all, how would I know what that project is about? How would I know how to contribute to that project? So it's just explaining that these projects are really good, but a documentation or a technical writer being involved in that community or that open source organization is also as important as the code that was used to build that open source project as well. So based on these surveys and analysis, like I've said, you just reiterate on what I've already mentioned. You'd agree with me that there are different people who decided to not use an open source project or to contribute to it because the documentations were bad, right? So that means if technical writers come on board and work with open source organizations, this problem will be solved. And let's say, for instance, GitHub carries out this survey again. I mean, it may not completely go down to zero, but I mean, you see maybe 50 people complaining about it, not 95. Or better still, this problem would not be the top problem that everybody is complaining about, right? So it shows that technical writers are so important to the open source community, like extremely very important, just as important as the software engineers. So now that you understand the importance of technical writers in an open source ecosystem or in open source projects, I'm sure the next question you probably ask is, okay, hey, now I understand, but how can I actually contribute to the open source project? So this is what I'll explain in this session. So the first thing would be to find a project. So there are two things to note here. There are already existing open source organizations that have a list of issues or like already have an existing documentation, right? So sometimes it may be necessary to find those projects, right? So let's say I'm interested in PyTorch, for instance, and I go to GitHub and I search for Python, trying to find open source projects that use that particular technology, right? And then I'll see tons of them. Out of this open source project, let's assume there are 10 projects, right? So out of these 10 open source projects using PyTorch, maybe 4 of them have a documentation already, right? And 6 of those projects don't have any documentation. So what I'll mention here is don't limit yourself to choosing projects that already have a documentation or like a structure for documentation going on. If you don't like that project, feel free to join any open source organization that does not necessarily have an open source project, sorry, an open source documentation, because you can be the person who decides to start it up in that community, right? So instead of like going to the ones that, oh, hey, they already have it and let me just go and contribute to. I mean, that's great too, if you're passionate about that project or if you would love to contribute to that project. But for instance, you don't find any project that you're interested in that has a documentation, feel free to go to any other open source project that you've used before and try to contribute to that project as a technical writer. And the next thing would be, after finding a project, is identifying an issue. So if you have chosen a project that already had an existing documentation base, what you need to do is go through their issues and try to pick the one that you want to solve. So these kind of projects would already have issues that have been reported by people in the community, right? So what you do is try to go through the issues and pick the one you want here, and then indicate your interest to the maintainer, for instance, let them know, hey, I'm actually interested in contributing to this project, or I'm not interested, like just let them know. But if you chose a project that does not have any sort of open source documentation yet, what you now do is try to use that project. And I'm sure when you're using that project, you would identify certain things that should have been written, right? Because I mean, using something for the first time may not always be completely easy. You would wish you probably saw a documentation that you could read or an article that could explain certain things. So when you've seen that that project does not have any of those things, you can now start writing it based on the experience you had while working on that project. And then open a pull request and let them know, oh, hey, I was trying to use this project and I couldn't find this information. And I feel that anybody who wants to contribute to this project in future may also encounter the same problem. So this is a documentation or this is a technical article that I've written to solve or answer the questions that I had, so that when next somebody's trying to use this project, it also helps the person, right? So that is like the first step towards building a documentation for that open source project. So before I go to the next section here, just note that you shouldn't focus on projects that already have documentation, right? Feel free to go to an open source project that does not have any and start it out there. Remember that 95% out of 5,500 people complain that open source projects either have incomplete or non-existent documentation. So the incomplete ones are the ones that, okay, they already have it. Then while there are others that do not even have it completely. So try to be that person who decides to start up one in an open source organization. And then the next one is to send a pull request. So assuming, let's keep assuming again, assuming you chose a project that has a documentation already, right? And you picked an issue. After working on that issue, you send a pull request. And most often than not, these open source projects or organizations have like a certain style guide they're expected to use. So try to ensure that you follow through that style guide of that particular open source organization. What do they want to see in that pull request? What should you add? What did you change and all that? And submit the pull request. But if you work with an open source project that does not have any style guide or any pattern for their pull request, then just feel free to include as much information that you think is necessary that will make the maintainer understand like the changes you've made and what have you, and add it to the pull request and then send it. And once you send us the pull request, obviously someone will come to like review what you've done and hopefully merge it or give you feedback. So these are some notable best practices when writing a documentation or a technical article for any open source project. It's important to follow a style guide. As you can see, I mentioned if they exist. So this means that there are some open source projects that may not have a style guide, right? But if you happen to find one, then ensure that you use that style guide, because it means that the people who are already in that organization or in that community sat down and thought about like the right ways to explain things to people that they will actually understand. So try to ensure that you follow the style guide that is based in that community. But if they don't have any, feel free to use maybe Google style guide or Microsoft style guide. I personally use that of Google because based on the technical writing course that I took some time ago, but I think Microsoft's style guide is absolutely amazing. I think they have one of the best documentations, if I'm not mistaken. So you can either use Microsoft or Google, or I'm sure there are tons of style guides anyway, but since this is more tech related, those are the two style guides that I recommend. And then second one would be that the page title should always reflect the content of your page, right? So assuming you want to talk about how to maybe say style components in React, for instance. So if you name it how to style components in React, the content should actually reflect that title. So don't tell me you want to teach me how to style components in React and then you're talking about how to become a technical writer in the content of the page. No. So whenever you're writing a technical article or a documentation, the title should always reflect the content. So for instance, I'm writing a documentation for VLC, for instance, and I'm trying to document how to use connect VLC to SMB to watch like videos directly from a server. So I should ensure that if I name it, hey, how to connect to SMB on VLC for iOS, the content of that documentation or that page should actually fit into the title. Don't try to go like sideways. Just ensure that you're focused and you're passing the information. Like you're always passing information straight to the point. Like there's no need to beat around the bush. And then the next best practices for me would be always define what the page is about in the first paragraph. So if you name your title how to connect VLC for iOS to an SMB server, the first paragraph should be something like, in this section or in this article, you will learn how to connect SMB to VLC for iOS, right? So the first paragraph should always explain what that page is about. The reason why this is important is because when people come to your article or that documentation, they want to have an overview of what this thing is actually about, right? I mean, I know the title might give you a clear picture of what the article or documentation is about, right? But an introduction is very, very important because it gives me an overview of what I'm actually going to read. And if I read the introduction and see that it does not have the information I need, I can easily skip through rather than reading the entire thing and getting upset that it doesn't have that information. And then I now feel like, oh, here I wasted my time on this documentation or this article. What that will do to the reader is make them feel like you don't know how to write well or you're not passing the information effectively. So always ensure that the first paragraph of your page that you're writing about has a brief introduction or a brief explanation of what the entire page is going to be on. This is not just for open source organizations. I think a lot of people don't do this when they write technical articles, and I don't think that is great. I think it's always important to let the readers know what they're getting themselves into. Would they find the information they need in this article? It's always very, very important to write a brief introduction about whatever you're writing about in the first paragraph. So, and then next thing is to consider your audience when creating content. When you're writing content for an open source project, always keep in mind that tons of people are using this project. So in my case, VLC, right? I know that there are so many people. I started using VLC when I was like in secondary school, right? So I mean, I wouldn't say I was as smart as I am now at that time. So it means that the documentation should be easy enough for someone in high school or someone in secondary school or primary school to understand it. Don't try to say, oh, hey, because I know this thing, every other person will know it. That's not true. So try to ensure that you're considering the audience that will be using that content you're creating. If you're working with an open source project that is built on React, always remember that your audience are people who understand React. So don't try to use Python concepts while explaining that article or that documentation. Always consider your audience, because these are the people who are going to read that documentation or that article you're writing. And then the most important one is avoid duplicating content. I mean, it's exciting to contribute to open source project. You're like, okay, hey, let me go and contribute and everything, but always try to take your time to look through existing documentations or articles on that open source project and ensure that what you're working on is not something that already exists. Don't just jump right into saying, oh, hey, I didn't see this, so take it here, I've done it. Try to ensure that you've carried out the necessary research. I mean, even research is a very important skill for technical writers. So ensure that you apply that your research skill into checking if this content or this thing you want to write on already exists. And if it already exists, then maybe try to improve upon what exists. Maybe send like pull request or issue on that existing documentation. Don't try to duplicate the content. All right, awesome. So we've covered what open source is, why technical writers are important in an open source project. We've also covered how to make a contribution as a technical writer and some best practices while making those contributions. So here I'm going to highlight some of the benefits of contributing to open source project. I mean, most times people feel like, oh, hey, I'm not getting paid to contribute, so why am I contributing? Why are people talking about contributing to open source? It's not that important, so why should I spend my time contributing to any open source project when I'm not being paid for it? I mean, it's even more difficult when you have like a full-time job or other responsibilities, to be honest. So it's kind of weird to tell someone to do something that they're not being paid for, right? But I'm going to explain some of the other benefits that may not necessarily involve money, but things that will be beneficial to you if you contribute to open source projects as a technical writer. First thing would be that your technical writing skill will improve. Like, trust me. The reason why I'm saying that is when you submit a PR, for instance, you're not the one reviewing it. It could be a maintainer that is in a different country or different continent from you that has a different perspective on how writing should be or how documentation should be like, right? So that person reviewing that documentation or that pull request that you made would give you feedback based on their perspective of what they understand, right? So imagine that you implement those feedbacks of like different people from all over the world. You'd see that your writing would become better. You will not just write specifically for maybe audience in Nigeria, but you're not writing for the international audience. Nobody from the US will come to read your article and be like, okay, what's happening here? What is she saying? Like, I don't really understand. You tend to know the right words to use that would help or make people all over the world to actually understand whatever they are reading that you wrote, right? So it basically improves your writing skill in tremendous ways because people are giving you feedback. Most often than not, you probably don't even receive feedback when you're writing technical articles or doing other things. But in this situation, you will always receive feedback from the maintainers in the open source organization. And then you expand your network. When you work with open source projects, you get to interact and connect with so many people. So in my case, for instance, since I work with VLC, I mean, I get to have conversations with the president of VLC, the iOS developer, and like tons of people in the organization that I would naturally not have had access to if I didn't contribute to that organization as a technical writer. Like, I mean, where in this world would I meet the president of VLC, or how would I ever start talking to him? So, I mean, he helps you expand your network. So for whichever project you're working on or whichever organization you find yourself in, as you help that organization or that project to build whatever they're doing, you get to know and like expand your network and meet other people, which is also really, really important. You know what they say about having people who can speak on your behalf. So if you're doing really great and helping an organization to improve their documentation, and for instance, one day you want to get a job, you can easily get recommendations or referrals from them, which basically moves in my next point, meaning that you can get recommendations or referrals from the maintainers that you work with. So if I ever want to become a technical writer in life, like full time, I mean, I can always reach out to the president of VLC and say, hey, can you help me write a recommendation? And I mean, anybody who sees that a recommendation is coming from that person, I like to think VLC is a really popular media player, so almost everybody should know it. So if anybody sees that, hey, my recommendation is coming from someone, the president of VLC, he or she would most likely want to give me a chance, right? Because it means I probably know what I'm doing. So it might not just be VLC, it could be maybe reaching out to like maybe say Wikimedia that I've contributed to as well. I'm like, hey, please, can you help me write a recommendation? Or can you refer me to a technical writing job? So this thing is giving you access to people that you would have not had access to, recommendations that you would have not had access to, or even referrals, right? So contributing to open source projects as technical writers gives you tons of opportunities. And then the next one is you'd also get accepted into the Season of Docs program. So Season of Docs program is a program that connects technical writers and open source organizations together and kind of encourage technical writers to contribute to the open source organization and get paid after contributing. So the amount that you get paid differs for different countries, but for Nigeria, it's actually like $3,000. I think $3,000 is definitely more than $1 million. So imagine being able to work with an open source organization and get like increase your network, get your recommendations, referrals, and also get paid more than $1 million for working for them in 3 months. That's a lot, right? So these are like opportunities that you get if you contribute as a technical writer. And then the final and most important one for me is you become an open source contributor, because you help to debunk the stereotype that open source contributions are only made for software engineers. So every single technical writer that is joining the open source ecosystem or is contributing to open source projects you're literally making the world a better place. You're literally removing stereotypes that exist that try to make other people who don't necessarily have skills as like to code or do other things to contribute to open source. So if not for any other thing, just so you help the world become a better place, contribute. So in conclusion, open source documentations help people who are new to the project understand what that project is about. It helps people to know how to contribute to that project in the future if they want to contribute. And most of all, it also shows that an open source project is actually a product that people are using and is actually effective. So when you contribute to open source projects, you're not just helping yourself improve your skill, you're helping thousands of people that may want to find, that may need to do something with that project but don't understand it. Your documentation could help thousands of people, or just like help, even if it just helps one person, it's absolutely fine. But just know that whatever you're writing is definitely going to help someone someday in the future. I hope you're able to understand and learn how technical writers can contribute to open source projects. If you have any questions, this would be a great time. So this is just like my Twitter handle and my blog, in case you want to check out some of the things I write. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Edidion, for that amazing session. Even though I see myself as, a bit of a technical writer, I still learned a lot. Like, one thing that really hits me was when you said you don't have to contribute to projects that already has a documentation. And
Yeah.
I think I can really relate to this because this kind of informed my project for Google Season of Docs. So
Mm-hmm.
I worked with Jenkins, and yeah, we know Jenkins has a lot of documentation, existing
Yeah.
documentation, but the specific project I worked on did not have any existing content, Jenkins on
Yeah.
Kubernetes, and
Mm-hmm.
that was why I worked on that project. So it's very important that people don't only look for projects that already have documentation. Then another thing is, I feel like this technical writing of a thing is really underrated in open source, because you know most of
Okay.
the times we have opportunities to actually make these contributions, but we don't just realize it, because a lot of times when you're using a particular software, and even if they have existing documentation, you are using the documentation, and along the line they said you should do something in the documentation and you try it, it doesn't work. When you're
Yeah.
able to find the solution, that's an opportunity for you to actually, you know, like improve the documentation. But people don't take note of things like
They
that.
won't.
You don't
Yeah.
have to be an experienced technical writer for you to improve documentation of the project, as long as you are using it. So
Yeah.
let's stop talking now. If you have any questions, please post them in the comment section so I can read them out to Didi and she can do justice to them. And if for any reasons, okay, so there's a question here. Okay, so someone said, so I'm a bit confused about how someone who had no coding skill we know what to write in the documentation. How do you understand what is going on if you don't write code?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So it's important to understand that not all, how do I put this? So for instance, if I'm writing a documentation on VLC, I'm writing about the application, like how to use those things. Like I gave an instance of trying to connect VLC to an SMB server. I don't need to understand what's going on in the code base of VLC to write that documentation. I just need to use VLC and know how to do that, right? So there's some documentation that does not necessarily need you to have an understanding of what the code base is about. So if you find yourself in that situation or in that open source organization, you can contribute to it, right? And then even if you don't understand how to code, there are people that, like, so in my case I work with one of the iOS developers, right? So for every single thing I don't understand, I reach out to him to ask him, hey, what's up, because VLC, I think VLC is written in like C# or like C++, and I have no idea what that is. I'm only on the JavaScript and Python side of things, right? So he must not necessarily know every single thing about this project, like the code base itself. There are always people who are willing to help you understand something. So whenever you have a question, you can reach out to one of the maintainers or one of the software developers and say, hey, I need to document this thing, but I don't understand what is going on in the code base, right? And then they would explain that thing to you in a way you would understand. So with that information now, you can now transcribe it or change it into a documentation. So my point here is you don't have to understand the code base. You don't necessarily need to have coding skills on that or to become a technical writer or to contribute to open source projects. It could mostly just be using that project, noticing something that is not already there, or using that project to add more information that was not existing before. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, you really did justice to that question. There is a huge difference between writing API documentation and writing how to guide. So if you're writing how to guide how to use a software, you don't necessarily need to know what is going on behind the scene, rather, to be
Yeah.
able to do that. So someone said, are we likely to write documentation? Oh, sorry. Are we likely to write documentations around how an end user can use an app, like installation processes and setup processes?
Yes, it could either be one of those tools, right? So when you're writing an open source documentation, it could either be to help people contribute to that project or help people use that project. So if you're helping people to use the project, then that means you're writing how to guys on how to do this and how to do that, how to connect this to connect that to use it. But if you're writing a documentation to help people contribute, then you're explaining things like installation. So if I want to contribute to Wikipedia, for example, I need to install, I can't really remember, but there are certain things you need to install, right? So you need to write documentation on how to install those things for whosoever wants to contribute. So it could be one of those things. It could also be both, depending on your capacity to contribute to that open source project. So, or are there documentations around how a developer like me should go on setting up? Yes. So, like I mentioned, it could be one of both. So, in this case, this would be the documentation that helps people to contribute, right? So, it would explain how to set up certain environments in order to write the code to help or like to contribute to that organization. So it can be one of two things. And again, even learning how to do does not necessarily require coding skills per se. You could always reach out to someone in the organization to explain the concepts or explain the thing you need to install or like the commands you need to use to install it. There's always so much information out there. The only thing you need to do is ask someone, and then someone will be willing to answer. Okay, I can't really hear you, Zainab.
Implementation. What types in particular
Okay.
are technical writers involved in?
There are several types of software documentation. What type of technical writers are involved in? I don't think technical writers are necessarily involved in one part. I think we're involved in every single thing. It depends on the organization or the place you find yourself in, right? As a technical writer, it means you're writing about technical stuff, right? Which involves software. Yeah. So whatever thing you have to document, it means you can document it if needed. And one of the important skills of a technical writer is understanding how to carry out research. So that means you don't necessarily need to know every single thing about something before you start writing it. All you need to do is like carry out the necessary research, find out the information you need to find out, speak to the right people, and start documenting that thing. So I wouldn't say technical writers are like maybe specific to like certain sections of software documentation. I like to think technical writers make up software documentation if you ask me. So I don't think one can exist without the other. Who writes software documentation is technical writers, right? So it's synonymous or they work hand in hand.
All right. Thank you so much, Edidion, for that explanation. I don't think we have any other questions. So, if you still have further questions later or you're confused about anything, you could always reach out to Edidion on Twitter at Didicodes, and I'm sure she'll be happy to answer you. So, I think that brings us to the end of this session today.
Okay, I guess Zainab's stuff had an issue. But anyway, thank you everyone for joining the session. I hope you learned a lot, and I also hope that you go for to make open source contributions as a technical writer. Okay, Jen, let me try to drop that for you.
All right. Okay, someone asked for some links in the comments. Can you leave some links to where writers can find open source projects to contribute to?
Yeah,
Do
let
you
me
have
try
any
to find.
resources that could help? Okay.
Yeah, I have one. I guess I can drop it in the private chat. Yeah, then you can because I can't seem to find where to comment directly from here. So I've dropped it in the private chat, and please can help me share it with them. But yeah, so
All
that
right. So,
contains list of open source projects that already have a list of documentation or have existing documentation. But like I mentioned, you don't have to limit yourself to working with only this kind of organizations. Feel free to be the one to start up a documentation in an existing open source project that does not have any.
all right. Thank you so much, Eddie Young. Thank you for this wonderful session. And thank you to everyone that took out time also to attend this session. If you have any questions, as I said earlier, you can reach out to Eddie Young on Twitter at DidiCodes. You can also follow our social media handles at SheCode Africa and at Oscar Africa for updates on our events and upcoming initiatives. Thank you for joining us today, and don't forget to join us on Saturday for the last session in this series. We have a special guest coming over on Saturday, so don't miss it at 2 p.m. on Saturday. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful day ahead. Stay safe. Bye.